It's okay to make changes during the sprint if what we're doing is the right thing at the right moment. But the moment you're making big changes and constant context switching, that means you're destroying value.
Client, their expectation is that they want us to go through a year of discovery for a massive behemoth of a project and give them a fixed cost and a fixed timeline. We're taking a gamble.
If you're working a fixed price project, every time you say yes to a customer, to a change, you're going to be losing money.
Agile is not meant for every project. For less complex, less variable, smaller projects, then probably not the right fit. It can be problematic when it's just followed blindly.
You've got mechanical Scrum, you've got zombie Scrum. There are like 50 terms. How many terms are there for Scrum that does work? Very few. People are just trying to follow all these steps, and then they're like, okay, we're doing Scrum, we're being Agile, and that doesn't work.
Maarten Dalmijn is the founder of Dalmijn Consulting and an expert in Agile methodologies, especially Scrum. He's the author of Driving Value with Sprint Goals and a renowned speaker and trainer. Maarten also contributes to Serious Scrum, the largest Scrum publication on Medium. Join us for our conversation with Maarten Dalmijn.
Well, welcome to the podcast, Maarten. It's great to have you on. Been following your content for quite some time and really excited to have you on and have a chat today.
Yeah, I'm super excited too. Lovely to chat.
Awesome. Well, for those that aren't familiar with your work and may not know who you are, give us a bit of a short introduction about yourself and your career so far.
Yeah. So, I started writing about Agile and product management stuff around, 9 years ago, something like that, 8 years ago. And I did it, as a side gig, I was just a full-time employee working in product management. And at some point I just got asked for stuff and I was like, why do I have a full-time job? And am I writing at night and doing all these presentations? It's insanity. So around 2 years ago, I started for myself. So I do Agile and product management consulting, training and workshops. And my expertise is Agile and product management. And I was a head of product. I was a senior product manager. So I come from the trenches. So now I just have to watch out that I don't just become a consultant, where I have been, I'm away from the trenches for too long. And that's maybe it. And I've written a book about sprint goals. So that's the first book about sprint goals. So that makes it the best and the worst book about sprint goals. And it's just a topic I was very passionate about. And I thought it deserved its own book. And that's why I wrote it.
Yeah, awesome. It's great. And I want you to unpack a bit more around sprint goals. What do they mean to you? And obviously you've written the book, but what are sprint goals and how do they differ from maybe how some people are running sprints, still today?
So maybe in a nutshell, right, what you probably have heard a lot is like output versus outcomes, right? The stuff you do versus what the stuff you do is going to help you achieve. And basically what sprint goals help with is they keep you anchored in what you're trying to achieve. And this is something that I don't want to glorify warfare in any way, but the military does this really well. Whenever there's a mission, there's a commander's intent. Like, this is what we're trying to achieve. This is the relevant context. And then the people that are supposed to execute the mission, they decide on the plan. They can change the plan as necessary as the battlefield unfolds, as the fog of war reveals itself, because you cannot predict what everybody. And basically that's what a sprint goal does. Basically, it provides the commander's intent of the sprint. And I think that's really crucial because as you probably have also seen, like if you tell people what to do and this is what you have to do, and they lack understanding of the why, then all they can do is do what you've told them. But if you have surprises, that may not be sufficient. If something goes on, and then they're screwed because they don't know the intent. And that's it in a nutshell, basically. And that's why I'm so passionate about it.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And I think it's a big challenge with anyone running sprints is like, how do we align and make sure we stay focused on the outcomes and the results and the objectives, right? I had a chat with Jeff Gotthealth about this as well, about OKRs, etc., but not exactly around sprint goals, but same kind of idea around, okay, how do we set the team free to go and achieve what those things are? And I think a big part of it comes back to stakeholder alignment and also the overall kind of, let's call it a project objective as well. Like, how do you align your sprint goals with your project goals or objectives, and how do you set both of those things?
Yeah. So what I think is really crucial if you're working on a project or something, basically it's something bigger, right? So you have to be very clear, like, hey, what are we trying to achieve with this bigger thing? And all the biggest difference is in a sprint, you're just trying to do something in a period of like at most a calendar month, where you're going to set a goal that brings you closer to that larger goal. That's all it is. And then, yeah, sometimes that can be hard, right? Because sometimes you've got a goal and you can make a step, but it's very hard to translate. Like, so what's the outcome? You know what I mean? So, yeah, I think the key thing is what is the best step you can take that brings you back towards that larger goal. And that's what you should try to do every sprint. Like think about what is the best thing we can do to bring, and yeah, because you do it that way, you can adapt, right? Because
Yeah.
every time you take a step, and when you take a step, like the fog is removed, you've got a better understanding of the situation. So you have a better information to make the next step and to set a new goal towards that larger goal. And that's basically what you do. And yeah, many Scrum teams, of course, obviously don't do this because they're all just focused on, hey, we've got a list of stuff to do. Okay, we completed the list. And then next sprint, we drag in a list. We're going to complete this list. But yeah, if you kind of, how you say, follow the complete the list approach, then you may not get where you want to go ultimately, because the big assumption is that before you started, that list was the list that's going to bring you closer to that goal. And there are no surprises and nothing unexpected. And as we all know, very, very unlikely in software development.
100%, yeah, 100%. And things change so much, right? And even what was the objective to begin with may be different now, right? So that list may have been relevant at that point, but now it's no longer relevant, right? Because of those things. And I think it's so important. And I think a big part of it is communication with stakeholders. Like how
Yeah.
a lot of, and this is something we've been discussing recently internally and externally with other people, but is like, especially when you get stakeholders that aren't necessarily as technical minded or don't understand your software development or what goes into it. Some of them are even looking at time, right? If that makes sense, where time, and it's not like, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to justify where our time goes. That's not the point, but people are kind of looking at time, and time is the deliverable, right? Or they're looking at, okay, how many tasks did we complete in number of tasks? The challenge is, how do we convert that to go, no, we're working towards the goal and the results and the objective, and
Yeah.
how do you suggest of communication to those stakeholders and even internally on making sure that we're all aligned on that goal and that success is centered around that goal, including the communication with that.
I think in the end, it all boils down to trust, right? I mean, imagine if you, I mean, I'm fortunate that we have a cleaning lady, right, to help out. We're not checking how, like, exactly how many hours she works. We just check at the end of the day, is the house clean? Are we happy? You know, that's what we care about. And I think that's the key thing, like building that trust. I think I've also, as you know, I've also worked at digital agencies, and what I've tend to see is when you start a relationship, you kind of have to build that trust in the relationship. And in the beginning of the relationship, as I may phrase it that way, they actually take a look at they will take a look more closely at the hours, what are you doing, the output. But I think the moment you start building more trust, they're going to focus more on, okay, are we happy with the results, like, and move away from that. And that's where you want to be. But I think it's very difficult to get there, right? It's not, I don't think, I mean, you have obviously more experience in this area than I do, but I've never started with a customer where it was immediately, there was that trust, complete trust from the start. You need to build that trust. And I think that's the key thing, building that trust. So, and also explaining when there are surprises, right? Involving them, letting them know ASAP, making them part of the problem. You know what I mean? These are kind of, but I'm also curious to hear your thoughts because I know you have a lot of experience.
No, it's definitely, it's a challenge. And absolutely, I agree. You've got to build that trust up front, and it takes time to build. And, as we know, trust takes time to build, but can be quickly eroded as well, right? In regards to it, a lot of it can be to the point of just misunderstanding, miscommunication, right, etc.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's so important that we stay on the same page. The challenges we have had is where some like key stakeholders, for example, don't want to be involved in sprint planning, or don't want to be involved. They only want to, their time is which is understandable, but very, very important. And they've got other things to do, which is totally understandable. But the question then becomes, well, if you aren't prepared to be involved, then it's very difficult for us to communicate with you and actually communicate what's going on. Yes, we can send an email report, but then that may not be satisfactory. You may not be happy with that, right? And so the challenge is that, it's vitally important that you build that trust, understandably, but it's also, I feel, on the other side of the street, if that's the way you want to put it, or it's a two-way street where those stakeholders are prepared to commit to putting time into understanding, etc. But you've got to earn that trust with them, and it is different for every single stakeholder, and you've got to adapt things to work with them, because you can't expect them to just mold to what you do necessarily, right? So, that's our what we've struggled with, and something that we battle as well. And I think a lot of it links back to as well is demonstrating to them that, and educating them that, like, we may not be perfect at the start. And I know this, you're big on this here, and I know you've talked about movies and games and all these other things, right? Where, like, we will suck to begin with, right? It's not that we're awful people or awful at our job, but with these kind of projects, we don't know what we don't know, and it's so hard to estimate things accurately. It's so hard to know exactly what we need to do, when, especially, like, the bigger and bigger and more complex it gets, the harder and harder it is. Like, the more and more risk, the more and more likelihood that things are going to go wrong. And so I think it's important that we communicate that iterative improvement and feedback loops. And it's not only about communicating with them the value that we're delivering and what we're doing, but it's like, you can help us improve, like, you can help us become better as well. What are your comments on that?
Yeah. So if I may add one thing to that, what I think is really crucial is, so what you tend to see, right? If it's very important to talk about mindset, because if they believe that the failure to deliver on time means you're incompetent, means it reflects bad. If they think that way, then you're already off to a rocky start. Because I think when you do complex work, the biggest problem is, it's not that we don't know what we're doing. It's that we don't know what we have to do. And that's a very fundamental difference. Like, and I think that's really crucial to manage those expectations, because otherwise, as you said, you have a rocky start in the beginning, and their first thought will be, wait, there are surprises. So if there are surprises, they must be incompetent. Wait, well, everything's going wrong. And if that, but the other way, and I think maybe a good way of looking at it, right? The difference between building a new house versus, like, renovating an old house, right? Imagine you arrive at an old house, and they just tell you, start today, how long it's going to take. And then you open up the floor and you find there's lead plumbing, the electricity's, and then you can get an idea, okay, this is how difficult it's going to be, right? But those are surprises, like, the moment you open. But if you build a new house, you have way more control, because, like, okay, so it's this kind of ground, so we need this kind of foundation. Okay, maybe you put a prefab, you know what I mean? It becomes far more predictable. And I think that's the key thing, to manage those expectations, because the fact that you have surprises doesn't mean you don't know what you're doing. It means, you don't know what's coming, what's heading your way, and you discover it.
Yeah, 100%. And I'll add to that, and I think it's a great analogy, and it's one I use a lot. I use construction to try and explain it to people that probably don't understand it as much. Software development I'm talking about, or web development, is, I totally agree with you. But even if we're doing a new build, so an old, or like a renovation is much more risky, like a rebuild. I totally agree with that, because you don't know what you're going to get. But even with a new build, the bigger and bigger the projects, like, the clients themselves don't even know what they want, right? They can't define, like, like, architecture or construction is so much easier, because you've got a floor plan and they say, okay, I want this. Now, okay, when you get into massive commercial buildings and that's the level of, like, where we're talking about with these engineering projects, software engineering projects, where that's the equivalent, right? Is that, but even so, it's more difficult than that. Like, we cannot define necessarily that the floor is going to be 100 meters long by 50 meters wide, right? With, like, it's just
You don't
not
even
like
know
that.
if they want a house. I mean, they tell you they want a house, but maybe they want a jacuzzi. And I think that's the
Go-
fundamental problem.
Absolutely. And then like we get into building the jacuzzi and it's got to be integrated with this, but now that doesn't support that. So now but we didn't know that, right? And then they've made an update, so now we've got to like redo half of what we did. And a lot of people like think this is excuses for things taking longer than they should, which I totally get that perspective, right? I totally understand that, but it's such like I've made a mistake, and I know this personally with like external stakeholders and others, of setting the wrong expectation, and from the beginning we're on the wrong foot, right? Like, because I've set an expectation that, okay, roughly here's what you can expect in the timeline, and that's straight away they've locked in on that, right? And it's like, and then it takes double the time and double the budget or something, but it's totally legitimate, but the expectation was already set, right? That was the mistake we made. And I think that is one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle, if that's the way we want to put it, of like up front, you have to be clear on those expectations and make sure that you aren't setting the wrong expectation. What are your comments on that?
No, I completely agree. So, for example, let's just make it concrete, right? Because I worked at a company that had to rebuild the complete e-commerce website of another company. So I think one of the very important things that you should do is not sell the whole thing. You know what I mean? It's better.
Yeah.
I mean, better to sell like the first piece and say, hey, like we're going to do something small, because then your team enters, they see the code base, they see, okay, it's way more bigger mess than I've expected, or a way less mess. Oh, wait, the stakeholders are way more immature. Like they don't have a good product owner or product manager. So they actually don't know what they want. So all these will affect your timelines. And I think the moment you do something small first, then the next stuff you do after, the next steps, you will have much better information and you can manage it, and certainly a lot better. Because you just don't even know if your two companies are going to get along really well, right? Sometimes you've got customers and clients that are super easy. Sometimes you've got, so all these factors affect timelines and predictability. And that's but I think one of the big downside of this approach is, of course, you want the big deal, right? You want to close the big contract. But I think the challenge is the moment you say, hey, we're going to rebuild your whole website, it's going to take 1 year, right? It's very difficult call to make. You haven't seen the code base, right? I mean, it could be possible, but I've seen rebuilds take 3 years, so.
Yeah, no, I totally relate to what you're saying, and I agree. It's very interesting. I think a big part of this comes back to, and I want to get onto this a bit more. We have touched on a little bit, is building trust in these agile projects, and for example, like for anyone listening, if we're talking about rebuilding a 3-page website, this doesn't apply to that. Like
No.
We're talking about large scale projects here for large companies that are extremely complex and have a lot of different moving parts and have moving requirements, have all of that kind of thing. And so I think it's important to note that. But when we are looking at these large projects, building trust, we've already touched on it, is so important. But from your perspective, why is it so crucial? And then how do you build that trust?
Yeah, I mean, so this project I just told you about, right? Actually, I worked at a digital agency. Obviously, I cannot divulge all the details. But what's very interesting is we had a very rocky start. And why was that? It was because basically they hired us to rebuild the website. There was a whole team that had no experience in the platform that they were using that was going to help them rebuild the website. So nothing was delivered on time. Everything took far longer than expected. Lots of back and forth. It was super messy. So you know what the company did? They hired one of the best experts in this platform to be part of the team, because it was not his first rodeo. He'd done it many times before. And then what we found is we became far more predictable. The situation improved. So I think being predictable, in a way, it creates trust. And it may be a little bit hard for me to say that, because the thing is, being predictable still doesn't mean that you're doing something valuable. To put it in writing terms, I've written a book, right? You could have write 10 pages per day, but still, you're very predictable, but the book is shit,
Yeah.
And I think that's the key thing. But I do think it starts with some degree of being predictable, and ideally that they see something tangible. They see something. So the moment that it's kind of like a submarine that goes underwater, and all they see is all these reports. Yeah, we finished the backends. We finished the API. The database is there. We have a CI/CD. That's the moment you lose trust, because they're not seeing anything. So maybe that's a good way of saying it, right? Seeing tangible results. I think that, and preferably a little bit in a predictable way, or at least frequently, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, at least frequently, that builds trust. So the moment it's all underwater, nobody sees anything, and we're talking about, especially like we've got a microservice, but nobody sees anything, that I think that destroys trust, because they feel like they're being played.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and it's something we've experienced ourselves as well, and something that you learn from, of how to change those communication patterns and how to change how you demonstrate value, right, in those kind of projects. One thing I do want to get your thoughts on, I've got some of my own comments on this as well, but how do you manage expectations for people that maybe not as familiar or lack that expertise in Agile?
Yeah. So the way I use very simple terms to talk about. So basically what I always say is, okay, when we're going to work together, we're going to have the fog of beforehand. That's how I call it. Like, there's just going to be this fog. And before we start, we simply don't know enough,
Yeah.
But then as we do the work, this fog is going to slowly be removed. We'll have a better understanding of the situation. And basically the key thing which I'm trying to manage is, we're going to have surprises. We're going to have stuff changing. But the good news is, like, the further along the way we are, the more we will know, the better understanding, and the how do you say, the better decisions we can make. We will become more predictable. We'll not be perfectly predictable. We'll still have surprises, but and I think the key thing which I tried to mention, so our natural response, right, when we lack information, is going in meeting rooms, talking, writing everything down. And that's the worst thing you can do, because all you're doing is you're writing all your understanding down that you have before starting, which is actually the point in time where you have the least understanding and the worst information. So what you're doing is you're overfitting your plans. You're injecting the fog of speculation. So you're actually creating a fog, making the fog worse. And I think that's really important to talk about. Even though all those roadmaps and those plans that look really good give us the feeling of control, they actually make our ability to control what's happening worse. And I think that's a really key thing. And it's very difficult to understand for customers. Like it's so no plan survives first contact with the enemy, right? That's exactly that. It's a quote from military warfare. But I want to stress, I don't want to glorify it once again, but it's just that kind of thinking. It's very unnatural to us. And yeah, it's important to talk about that, because it is unnatural to everyone. Because in school, you're taught, they teach you, right? Here's the book, you study everything, perfect information, and you can ace it. But in your world, you cannot ace it, right? You start and you're just going to be like, oh, wait, this is different than I expected. And I think that's the key thing. And that's what you should be talking about. And it's not easy to understand.
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree, and I can absolutely relate to it. One interesting thing or question I'd have is, like, how do you handle like strong client opinions on what should be done and what shouldn't be done? And I suppose the question comes back to as well, I've got some comments on this here around, like, if a client doesn't understand, it's our job to educate them, but if they don't understand why we're doing, Agile or the way we're doing it, then we're probably not the right fit. That's probably the first thing, because if their expectation is that they want us to go through a year of discovery for a massive behemoth of a project and, give them a fixed cost and a fixed timeline, we're taking a gamble. Right, suddenly the risk is on us, because
Correct.
We, as you said earlier, like if you're talking about doing a renovation or something like that, you rip up the floorboards and go, oh, your heart sinks. You're like, wow, there's a massive problem here. We're now on the line trying to fix your problem, right? And so, how do you handle that with clients? Where, or when is it just a simple case of, okay, we've done what we can to educate you, and we've put it as simply as we can, and there's all legitimate reasons as to why this is. Maybe we're just not the right fit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's give you a tangible situation. Like, so I want to stress, I'm working in the Netherlands. So how do you say, we have a very direct culture, but so this is just a story from this digital agency. I was actually like a QA engineer. Like I was at the bottom, if you may say that, right? And I mean, at the bottom, at the same level as the other developers, right? I mean,
Yes.
So basically, our customer was super unhappy because we're missing every deadline, and I kept telling like to my management saying like we're missing deadlines because every bug that they find, they make it a blocker. Every single bug, even though it's totally trivial. So of course we're missing deadlines. And after 3 times, telling to my management, I was super frustrated. So you know what happened? I was actually in a meeting room with the customer. And I'm not saying this is what you should do, right? But what I did was the customer was exploding, right? Like, why can't we deliver on time? And blah. And I had it. So I actually exploded back to the customer. I said like, of course we're not delivering on time, like everything's a blocker. And so it got really tense, right? And then I said, look, here's what I would suggest. You could be wrong, or you could be right. I could be right. It doesn't matter. Let's just look at the facts. Let's look at the last 10 bugs that we created. And I will ask you, are those really blockers? Right? Let's just see. And I will guarantee you more than 80% are not blockers, but they're created as blockers. And if I'm wrong, I will apologize, So we did that. We went through those 10 tickets, right? And you know what happened afterwards? He apologized to me because he said, whoa, like this is really bad. So I'm just saying like, this is not the way I would have done it now, right? Because you're risking the relationship. It's not professional, right? But what I do think is good, you need to talk about the actual problem and you need to kind of, make that tangible. And in this, what happened afterwards? I got a gift card from my employer, because I had fixed that issue. And the relationship changed because of that. So maybe you also have a story to share like this, but I do think this is what you should be talking about. And you have to have a little bit of a confrontation, maybe not as poorly managed as I did, but otherwise you're not going to solve the problem by dancing around it,
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And ideally, a lot of these things would be like the relationship, but it doesn't always work this way. But ideally, those expectations, those things would be worked out from the outset, and expectations would be clear as to here's where we stand. And I think it's important for someone like, especially us in our position, to take control of that and say, here's how we do it, here's how we run it, and here's why. If you don't align with that, then we're probably not the right fit. Now, that doesn't mean we're perfect. That doesn't mean that we can't improve. That's not my point whatsoever. It's more the fact that here's how we do it, and here's how we deliver, and here's why, and we've got reasons for that. If you're in on that and you understand why, then we're probably a good fit. If you are going to oppose that at every turn, we're just going to hit heads like the whole time around it. And that's where, like, what are some signs from your perspective that trust in a team or things aren't going right, from a stakeholder and a team perspective? What's those signs where things are going wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things which are, like, you have these. So I think one of the big problems is, especially if you're working with bigger companies, then you're going to have these change advisory boards, you know what I mean? Or like these status update meetings. And I think one of the big problems there is you have the people that do the work and they know what's happening. And then you have some kind of like ritual meeting where it's kind of like, okay, we want to keep the customer. So we present green, but we also, and I think that's one of the things, like, everybody has to be aligned. The moment you have management and the people from the, like, doing the work on the side of the client, they have very different expectations or very different perceptions of how it's going. I think that's one of the biggest red signs that something is really, really going wrong. Because at some point, the difference in reality, it's going to come out. And the longer, if it takes a few months, it's going to explode, because and I think that's one of the big things to watch out for. Does everyone have the same expectations? The example I just told you is a good example of that. Like the person I was talking to, like one of the higher people, they were not aware about the bug situation, even though it was relayed, and these are kind of, I think, really big red flags. So lack of transparency, basically. or different views on how things are going. I think that's one of the biggest red flags. I'm also curious. Maybe you have some more, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Transparency and communication, I think, of what it comes back to. The struggle we've had with some particular projects is engaging those stakeholders enough to give us that time, right? Is where, and we could have done better, and like no doubt, like there's so many things we could have and still can improve on, if that makes sense. Like I'm not saying that by any stretch of the imagination, but it is hard. Like when someone won't give you time or doesn't respect it, but then jumps into the project, and things can be flipped on its head. It's like it's challenging for us. I'm not saying they're wrong. That's their reality, if that makes sense, right? The challenge is, how do we engage them enough to prevent that happening? How do we present that value and communicate with them? And to me, it's about, in my opinion, it's about being clear and upfront in expectations, rather than being afraid to say that upfront. You'd be better to say upfront, here's how we do it, here's how we work, here's what we expect from you, and if you don't meet that, here's what will happen, if that makes sense, right? So if you don't attend this, or you don't look at these reports and reply, and if we need to improve, let us know and give us that feedback. If you don't do those things, we're going to end up in a situation where you're unhappy with us. Why do we know this? Well, we've seen it happen before, right? And so I think that's important, is just setting the expectations and the communication, all of that up front, and then setting out, like, if this doesn't happen, then this is what the result will be. And if that happens, we've already said it, kind of thing.
And I also think it's really crucial, like, even when you manage those expectations, they're probably in the beginning, they're going to, they've got, these companies, there's a lot of firefighting, other stuff going on. So they might from the beginning already become a little bit detached. And I think it's really crucial then to have immediately like a conversation before it's too late. And just to say, like, look, like, hey, like, you don't want them just to manage by the results. You want them to be involved in the process, because the problem is when you have bad results, you're already too late, kind of,
Yeah.
And
I agree.
And that's why you want them to be involved in the process. And it's not easy, because I think one of the big challenges is these companies, they generally hire you because you're the expert and they're not the experts, and they've got expertise in other things, and they want to focus on that because that's what they're good at. That's what they like doing. And then you come along, and I think that's also maybe a good thing, like use their expertise, get them like to talk about the stuff that they're excited about a little bit, because then they'll be more engaged, the moment you start. So that's also a big problem I see with development teams. They really start talking about all the technical stuff at the sprint review, like they don't care about those things, and I think that's the key thing. Like, you have to really watch out that you don't disengage them by just talking about your world related to their world. So speak their language. Okay, so we've refactored the code. Okay, that's going to enable that you can launch that marketing campaign instead of 3 months in 2 weeks. Now they're listening. So I think that disengagement may also can be a result, of not adequately speaking their language and kind of like staying in your own lane, speaking your own technical language. So that's something which I think can make a big difference as well.
Totally agree. And it's where we've made mistakes in the past, and we've still got improvement now, if that makes sense, of like setting those expectations clearly and then like sticking with like an update. I totally agree with like putting things in stakeholders. The way I describe it is in their terms or in their world, as you've said, like where they can understand it, and just simple language, right, where they may not be familiar with it. But we've made mistakes with that in the past, and what it ends up in is that eventually things bubble over and boil over, and it all comes to a head, and it's like, hey, maybe how do we prevent this moving forward, right? And those regular touch points, I totally agree. Moving on just a bit more around, how do you handle like changing priorities in Agile projects? And this is where Agile over against your normal waterfall, right, your traditional waterfall, with these larger projects we understand is so much better, and why. But how do you overall like handle situations where clients are changing their mind mid-project, or requirements are changing, etc.? First, like, how do we handle it, and why is it's really the basis of Agile, isn't it, right, to a degree?
Yeah. So one thing to keep in mind, right? Your context determines as well, like how you should handle it. Because if you're working a fixed price project, despite you're doing sprints, every time you say yes to a customer, to a change, you're going to be losing money. You know what I mean? So, but on the other hand, you want to keep them happy because you want to get the next contract. So I think context matters. So what I'm going to say really also depends on context. I'm not like covering my, skin, but I'm just trying to say, like, I think it really depends. But I do think the key thing there is, at least if you're working with sprints, there should be one clear goal every sprint. But how you achieve that goal is flexible. The sprint is flexible. And I think it's okay to make changes during the sprint if what we're doing is the right thing at the right moment. It's going to enable us to deliver more value. But there's a but. The moment you're making big changes and constant context switching, that means you're destroying value. Because if you basically say, hey, during the sprint, this is the most important thing, and then halfway you change that and you have to work on something else, that's really something you have to talk about. That should not be happening. That means that's a big problem. But the moment you're basically, you have the fog beforehand, right? You start the sprint, you discover, wait, if we could do it this way, it's going to take a little bit more time. It's going to be twice as good. Then I think it's very justified to do it. But it also depends on your context, right? Because maybe you're building a tool to launch a marketing campaign and it has to be done in 2 months. Well, then I would say, write it down. First, finish the whole thing so that you're like safe, and then work on the stuff, the icing on the cake. Because time that you spend now, you cannot spend it later. So I think it's really context dependent. And as long as you're very aware of the context, and you can also communicate it to the client, like, hey, we could add this improvement now, but you want to go live in 1 month. So I think it makes much more sense to add it later if we have the time, if time permits. So these are the kind of conversations. And I do think that scope changes are supposed to happen because what we're doing, Agile, is because we have surprises, but too many scope changes, and that's where you have to really watch out. Like, where do these scope changes come from, and what is the impact on the productivity? Because the productivity basically is how much value you can deliver, right? So, you have to watch out.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think a lot of it comes back to as well, like anchoring it in, is this aligning with the project goal, the overall objectives and what we're trying to achieve, and are we getting knocked off course or are we not? And and it's so nuanced, right? Like, it might be a small change or it might be a massive change. It might be a certain project or a certain client. Context matters, but overall with these large projects, I like how you describe it with the fog, is that, like, when we start the project, it's when we actually have the least understanding of what we're trying to do. And so, yes, obviously, especially if we're building an MVP or something like that, we have to have some discovery. Like, we have to know a rough outline, a rough framework. We have to start with something, but we have to be open to the fact that is going to evolve and adapt over time. And we're going to learn more, and we constantly need to evolve and adapt that over time. And I think that's where Agile comes in, is the fact that let's say, for example, we're going to build a completely, some new software that's going to help operations efficiency or automating operations, or we're going to rebuild a legacy platform or a website, whatever it is, a large project, like for a large one, not just your run-of-the-mill stuff. Then, we can put all these predictions and roadmaps and timelines and estimates. In your opinion, with those scale of projects, how many times out of 100 are you actually going to deliver that on time and on budget?
Budget? I mean, if it's really a complex project like a rebuild, I have to be frank, I've never delivered on time. And I want to stress, these have been like where we actually broke everything down. We estimated everything. And as well, like others where we just made stuff up. Like, we spent 2 hours on it, I've never, so out of 100, right? Probably 5 out of 100 or maybe something like that. That's what I'm thinking. But I think it's as well really context dependent. There's as well like Netscape rebuild. Netscape rebuilt this product. There's a very famous article, I think by Jules Polsky. He said things you should never do. And number one is rebuilding a product. And he talks about Netscape, how they rebuilt their whole product. And I don't know how long it took, but many years. So basically, yeah, that's one of the reasons why Netscape like didn't really make it. I mean, of course, their code base, I don't know all the details, like still lives on in Mozilla and all this stuff. So it's not completely gone. But yeah, that rebuilding is a huge mistake. So I think very, very rarely with big projects is that they're delivered on time. You know, I'm curious to hear your experience.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think a lot of people listening or someone that aren't familiar with it will be like, oh, yeah, it's just an excuse to charge more or to be late or to whatever else. When it's not, the problem is that we don't know what we don't know, and it is so complex, and like this is where it's like the diminishing returns, right? Where we can spend so much time on discovery, which we let's say a year for these kind of projects, and by the time we've done that, half of it's irrelevant, right? We've forgotten 90% of what we already did, right? Okay, we may have documented whatever, but there's just so much to take in at the time that it becomes some of it like we lose out on opportunities, etc. And I don't know. I just find it a fascinating discussion because I'm always struggling to how we better educate clients and people just in general as to why it's important that they understand that these projects, it's not just an excuse, let's put it that way, and just a way to, to dance around accountability, I suppose, is the way to put it for teams. It is an actual fact that we deal with. And if we've got the right people in the right seats or the right team working on it, that team will be trying to deliver as fast as we can, because at the end of the day, your success is our success, and we want a long-term partnership, I suppose, is the way, from my perspective.
Yeah, but I think what you're saying, I really get it. It feels like such a like dodging accountability. Like it feels like, and it's not that. You know what I mean? It's trying to really adequately manage expectations. And I think, the failure to predict doesn't mean we don't know what we're doing. That it's kind of like the weather, right? Same with the weather. Like the weathermen, they're so often, and women, they're wrong so often, and the closer you get to the date, the more accurate they are. But it's the same thing. We don't say, they suck. They don't know what they're doing. No, we really understand it. The weather is inherently unpredictable. It's not that they're not taking account. And I think that's the same thing. But it's hard, right? You have to talk about it.
It is. And I think we probably sound like broken records, but it comes back to managing expectations, right? Like with rebuilds are so much more difficult, because obviously those expectations somewhat have already been set. New builds as well are difficult no matter what. But again, if we set the expectation from the beginning, then I think that's important. It probably leads me into my next point from someone like our perspective, and no doubt you've had experience with this here. We've touched on it a little bit before as well, but fixed price versus agile contracts, right? And this is where these things come into play, and where in our world where clients are like, well, we want a fixed cost, and I totally understand why that is, right? Okay, because you want to budget for it, you want to know the worst case scenario, you don't want to have an open-ended, we have no idea what this is going to end up costing us. But at the same time, right, you're asking us to commit to something, for example, like a renovation, where there's so many more potentials to things to go wrong than just electricity or something like that. But we could find out that all the foundations of the entire house and everything else are completely ruined. And yes, we can mitigate some of these things to begin with as well. Absolutely, I agree with that as best we can. But there is just so many more variables at play here. And what are your comments there on fixed price versus agile contracts?
Yeah, I mean, there are situations where I would ask for it, right? But I think it's very challenging, like, because basically, as you said before, you phrased it very beautifully. You're putting the risk with the agency, right? Because there is a risk. And I think one of the problems as well is generally in these situations, there will be multiple agencies competing, right? and basically, they just look at the price, but the thing is, how do you say it? I don't think the margins are that huge. I mean, but it could be like a difference in scope between like, I don't know, 2 times or 3 times or 4 times. So I think it's so difficult. I've actually worked at digital agencies where they sold like projects for a few hundred K and they lost a few hundred K. You know what I mean? Because they did this wrongly. And yeah,
Absolutely.
I think that the most important thing is I would try to do is, and which is not possible always, right? Keep things simple. You know, it's so there's actually research done, right? Like if you give people like a puzzle, there are 2 ways of solving it. Way one is like adding 2 things, you know, and the other option is you remove 2 things. Both just perfectly adequate for solving the puzzle. You know what like 90% of people do? They add. And I think it's our nature to add, because removing is scary. You know, it means we lose something. But I think that's the key thing. Like keep it as simple as possible. Like remove stuff. You can always add stuff later, you know, unless you screw that up too. But that's one of the things, because then you make the project less risky, you know? But the moment you have this huge contract with all these bullet points, you know, we want a CRM integration, we want this. Man, like I don't know how you can fix that, because I don't know how to solve for that, because you're just, you know.
Yeah, I agree. Unfortunately, we've learnt the hard way with that, and we've had contracts that they've gone the way that you've mentioned. You know, we stuck to our word and we've delivered, but it's come at a cost. And that's why you learn your lesson. And the biggest thing is around, we still struggle with today, and it is educating and demonstrating to clients around why. And if you do a good job of this, then it's mostly understood by the right people. But is explaining that yes, there is a potential that this, here's a range, but you need to understand that is subject to change depending on these factors. And it is so difficult. And I think there's obviously a place for fixed contracts, right? We don't disagree with that. When there's smaller projects with a much more defined scope and a limited scope, and we've got one objective, right? Then understandably, someone would expect a fixed contract. But then when we've got these much larger builds with many moving pieces, and we might have a website with a portal that has integrations. The integration does different things. The portal itself is a whole project. All of these different things. We're basically gambling.
yeah, you're gambling. That's it. That's exactly. You just don't know. It's kind of like, here's a jar of pennies. I'm going to show you a picture of the jar. You just see the front. How many pennies are in the jar? You don't even see how big it is. I mean, you just don't have enough information. And yeah, you're kind of like rubbing your crystal ball, praying. Yeah. And I think that's really tough. So, but what I find interesting is like, so you're usually competing with other digital agencies. There's going to be probably one of them that says, okay, we can do it for 800K. I'm sure we're going to be on time. No uncertainty. You know what
Absolutely.
I mean? And then they're like, oh, we love this person, like, yeah, like they know what they're doing. They just sell it. Like, yeah, man, we've done it so many times before. We've did it for this customer and this customer, blah, 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 blah. No, like, and then they go for that person. And that's, I think, the challenging part. Like you need to add nuance and risk, but then it seems like you're dodging accountability. You're already covering your behinds, because and that's what sucks. I think that's the game. Yeah.
I can relate to it because I've been on both sides of the fence, right? I've been when early days when the agency, that's what we'd do, right? And that's what we thought was the right thing to do. We've learned from that in regards to understanding the fact that you're taking a huge risk, and the reason we learned from it is you realize that we lose out, right? We're the ones that basically lose a large amount of money because clients just say, oh, yeah, that was part of the original discussions, remember back? And it's like, no, it wasn't, right? But then what do you do, right? You've got to balance that expectation and you're trying to keep the client happy. I think the biggest mistake, and this is from our own learnings is we've set the wrong expectations, if that makes sense. And if we set the expectation with the client, we can hardly blame them, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because we're the ones that set that expectation. And so if we set the expectation that it's going to be, fixed price, and even expectations around when you do something for free or as a gesture of goodwill, suddenly that influences the expectation, because then when you go to charge a variation or you need an extra sprint or whatever else, right? Oh, well, can't you just do it for free, kind of thing? And it's like you're really hurting the client in the end as well. And that's what I've learned. You're saying again about that, that 800K example, when yes, so we'll come in and say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. Here's our approach and here's a realistic view. And, we're higher price, okay, because we believe our approach and our team and everything else is better. But also we know how these projects go, and we've given you a more realistic look, and we've given you that range, etc. Why? Because we want to be honest and upfront and set the expectations clearly. But it can work against you, right? Because then it's like, oh, well, we're not going to use you then because of this. They've given us a fixed price. How do you deal with that? All right, what are your comments on that? It's difficult, very difficult.
Yeah, so I don't know, right? Like, I think it's really tough because I've also been on the other side hiring a digital agency, and this actually was a case where I wanted a fixed price project because I was working at a startup and we were building the same kind of integration over and over again, just in different platforms. So we approached, for example, a Drupal plugin agency and just said, hey, we want this plugin. Here's what it should do. We've already built 10 of them, but please tell us, you're the Drupal experts. Like, how does this work in the world of Drupal? We can write the requirements together, but the intent was clear, basically what we were trying to achieve. And I would just tell them, you put a number on it. I don't really care what number, like a number that you feel comfortable with. And I will go back to the customer, because basically it was a startup, right? So I actually sold it to a client because they wanted it. So they were paying the development. So I said, I don't want to go back for more money, like just give me whatever number you. And these were generally delivered on time and the agency made money. And why was that? Because these were not huge projects, They had done these kind of things before. They were the experts in this Drupal plugins. So, or whatever plugin it was, Sitecore, and then I think it can work. But I think the key thing there is as well, like what you said. In this case, you're probably going to lose because you've got deal A where the agency is going to take all the risk, But I think what you don't see is what you're losing by taking that deal, and it's very intangible. But what it basically is, you're going to get what you asked for, and what you asked for was at the point of time where you get the least understanding of the situation. And the other party is actually going to limit changes. They're going to work against you actively. I mean, that's what it boils down to, because they're just going to say, this is the contract, this is what we agreed upon. And of course, you will have a worse result. It will be cheaper, but you're going to have a worse result. So, yeah. But you don't see that, you see that afterwards, you realize it.
Yeah, and the challenge is that, like, when you try and demonstrate that to someone in a stakeholder, and again, it's our job to do it and build trust as the team doing that. But, their point is, oh, you're just trying to throw them under the bus because you want the deal, right? Like it's so challenging. And it's our job to overcome those things and build the trust and establish the relationship. And then they realize that, okay, we're the right people to deliver that. So that's our job, and the buck stops with us to do that. But essentially it is no doubt a challenge that, those things do come into play with these kind of projects. But again, I think if you can demonstrate that we understand your business, we understand what you're trying to do, we understand the project, we understand the objectives, here's how we can help you get there, but here's how we need to do it. Why? Because we know what we're doing and we've done it before, right? If you can understand that, they're really the key pillars. And that's, again, it comes back to transparency and trust that we discussed earlier, right? Once you're on that page and they go, you get it, we know that you get it, then, we've got a lot more, what's the word? Freedom, I suppose, to move forward quicker then.
Yeah, I think the key thing is there as well, like convince them to start with something small, like if that's possible, because then there's less risk. You can even do that a little bit fixed price, because the thing is, if it's something small, the risk is less. And you also know we're doing something small. There's other stuff coming later when we have a better understanding, and then you can get money from that, but it's all the assumption is, but that's something, you can do, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. That kind of leads me into next point around Agile Dogma. But essentially, for anyone listening that are not familiar with what that is, but essentially following Agile blindly without understanding like the principles or why we're doing it. I think we touched off on this a little bit around, not Agile doesn't work for everything. Agile is not meant for every project. We shouldn't try and force it where it's not meant to be used, etc. And it ends up creating more problems than it's worth when it is done. And I think, as we've kind of discussed, and you can put your own comments here as well, but a lot of this comes back to for less complex, less variable, smaller projects, then probably not the right fit, right? It's better that we'd go with a fixed deliverables, kind of fixed scope, etc. And that. But then as soon as we start adding in all of these variables, much larger scope, much larger complexity, that's probably where it works. But it can be problematic when it's just followed blindly, right? And that's probably where a lot of these bad experiences come from. I don't know. What are your comments on that?
Yeah. So what I find very interesting, right? There are so let's talk about the elephant in the room here. Most Agile is Scrum. That's the reality. Because Scrum is the most popular Agile framework. Now you can argue, is Scrum Agile or not? Let's put that aside. Like it is an Agile framework, but you may not agree. But here's the interesting thing. If you look at there are so many words for Scrum that doesn't work. You've got mechanical Scrum, you've got zombie Scrum, you've got flaccid Scrum, you've got dark Scrum. There are like 50 terms. How many terms are there for Scrum that does work? Very few. Like you've got professional Scrum, you've got true Scrum or something. They're more like marketing terms. So what am I getting at? It's kind of like, Eskimos have like 100 terms to describe snow because it matters for the reality. And I think we have like 50 terms for Scrum that doesn't work because very often in reality, Scrum doesn't work. It's what people are just trying to like follow all these steps. And then they're like, okay, we're doing Scrum, we're being Agile. And I think, how do you say, that doesn't work.
No, I agree. And this is where, again, the reason I want to touch on, I think it's certainly important, is that for people to realize that for me and for us, and again, this is different for everyone's context and reality, right? We were talking about that earlier, but for in our world, it's the smaller projects that we describe as smaller projects that are, less complex, pretty straightforward. Then it doesn't make sense necessarily, to be doing that. But then the majority of our projects, which are these larger, complex, lot of variables at play here, we want a dedicated team running on Scrum that understand the why, understand the goals, are setting the goals, are deeply involved with the stakeholders, right? And are aligned with the vision of where we're trying to go, and can deliver on those things. And I think a key, even coming back again to the expectations point, is if we're looking at those longer term projects, we know that team's not going to be great at the beginning necessarily. Doesn't mean it's an excuse for poor behavior or whatever else, but we know that as we go, the velocity is going to increase, right? And with those larger scale projects, we will always outperform waterfall if we manage the expectations right. That's the key thing.
Yeah, you're spot on.
Awesome. Well, I think it's been an awesome chat today, and I appreciate everything that you've shared, Maarten. And I've learned a lot from you, so I appreciate it. I love your content, etc. as well. So I'll be definitely continuing to follow closely on that. I do what I call a bit of a finale segment with each guest that comes on, and ask a couple of questions before we close. So I'd love to jump into those now, if you don't mind. But the first one is, what's one thing you believe businesses are not paying enough attention to right now that will be critical in the next 5 years?
Oof, that's a big question. What is one thing
you believe businesses are not paying enough attention to right now that will be critical in the next 5 years?
Yeah. So I believe we need different. We need different ways of working. You know what I mean? Like I think one of the big challenges is as companies grow, you get more layers, you get more. I think we need to think about more like, how do we preserve these teams of teams, right? Like these small, nimble teams that they deal with surprises. How can we get them? Lots of organizations are still not paying enough attention to this. Like I think the default, what I always see is like more layers, coordinating stuff, but you can't coordinate what you don't know. You need to respond in the moment. And I think that's really going to change. And I think AI will change that a lot, because basically you can work with smaller teams, they can get more done. So it's going to be way more interesting. And maybe we're going to have smaller organizations as well. Because I think huge organizations just are systems of their own with their own behaviors, which just make everything, it's very difficult to control them. So long answer, but that's what I think.
No, appreciate that. The next one is, what legacy do you want to leave in your industry? And then how do you hope your work will influence or shape the future?
Yeah. So if I make people look at the world differently as a writer or as a speaker, that makes me happy, because it means that people have a new viewpoint, very specifically, I hope people will leave more room for surprises. You know what I mean? That's what in my writing. I always try to write like, you don't know as much as you think, And I think as a kid, right, as a teen, I was always planning ahead, of thinking ahead. And I think what's really crucial, I hope that people will like try more stuff out, see what happens and learn from that, instead of, already self-selecting themselves out, because they already think I'm going to be bad at it or I'm not. I hope that's the kind of thinking I will inspire. Like, just try something out, keep it simple, instead of like trying to plan everything and making it complicated. Yeah.
Very good. Very good. And the final one is, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give to your younger self at the start of your career?
Yeah. Take more risks. It's okay to fall. Doesn't make you less of a human being, less smart. You learn from mistakes, and it's okay. And I think that's the main thing. Like, I remember, for example, applying to jobs where I was just looking at, do I meet all the criteria? I was already self-selecting, so myself out. So that's the main thing. Take more risks. Like, it's okay. You will learn from it, and you will learn more from that than thinking that you know what's going to happen, because you're not that smart to simulate reality in your head.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the conversation. I think it's been great. I appreciate everything you've shared. For anyone listening that wants to learn more about Maarten, you can find him on LinkedIn and any of his other channels as well. He's got some great content, as well as you can head over to our learning center at intuji.com, or check out the YouTube channel or any other channels on Spotify, etc. There's heaps of other episodes with other great guests as well. So let us know if you've got any guest suggestions, any feedback as well. We're always interested to hear that as well. So thanks again, Maarten. It's been a pleasure. It's been a great conversation, and no doubt we'll keep in touch.
Thank you for having me.